So this is 27 past 11 GMT on Sunday, the 30th of August, 2020. This is a day later than the actual date of Qazi Nazrul Islam, the rebel poet, and passed away in 1976. Now, Qazi Nazrul Islam is known, of course, as the rebel poet, and the rebel poet is actually named after his poem called The Rebel. So I'll try to read this one. Bolo bir, bolo unnoto mamo shir, shir nehari amari, noto shir oi shikor himadrir. Bolo bir, bolo মহাবিশ্বের মহাকাশ ফাড়ি চন্দ্র সূর্য গ্রহ তারা ছাড়ি ভুলক দুলক গোলক ভেদিয়া খোদার আসন আরশ ছেদিয়া উঠিয়াছি চির বিস্ময় আমি বিশ্ববিদাত্রীর মম ললাটে রুদ্র ভগবান জলে রাজ রাজ টিকা দীপ্ত জয়শ্রীর বলবীর আমি চির উন্নত শির আমি চিরদুর্দম দুর্বিনীত নৃশংস মহাপ্রলয়ের আমি নটরাজ আমি সাইক্লোন আমি ধ্বংস আমি মহাবয় আমি অভিশাপ পৃথিবীর আমি দুর্বার আমি ভেঙে করি সব চুরমার আমি অনিয়ম উচ্ছৃঙ্খল আমি দলে যাই যত বন্ধন যত নিয়ম কানুন শৃঙ্খল আমি মানি না কোনো আইন আমি ভরাতরি করি ভরাডুবি আমি টর্পিডো আমি ভীম ভাসমান মাইন আমি দুর্জটি আমি এলোকেশে ঝড় অকাল বৈশাখীর আমি বিদ্রোহী সুত বিশ্ববিদাত্রীর বলবীর চির উন্নত মমশির. Now this is only a part of the poetry. It is longer and I shall be doing the rest of the reading. But first of all, I have to say about the translation into English, because this program is mainly in English, and the reason is quite historical, very connected with Nazrul, because he was imprisoned by the British imperialists about 100 years ago, around 100 years ago. And the English translation that is available online, as far as I can see, and most promoted by the various people who refer to Nazrul, is the one done by a man called Kabir Chaudhry. But his translation is very weak. Now, if that is the best translation of Nazrul, then he needs to be updated and kind of the translation has to be done. I have been trying to translate it in between various campaigns and issues and confrontations that I have been having to deal with over a long time. And I have done about 5 or 6 or 7, maybe 10 versions of the translation. And I'm still not satisfied that the translation actually does Nazrul's original justice, because translation is a different language and there are various issues involved in the translation. In order to make it most authentic and accurate, there has to be a translation of the imagery, the various rhetorical references that are in there. And those are based on religious, cultural, and other background and relationships that are not available in the frameworks of the English language. That said, the actual progress and the force and the power and the movement and the ferocity of renunciation of oppression and imperialism and wrong things in Nazrul's Rebel are not easily identifiable in anything similar that has existed in the English language that I can find. And Nazrul, in my understanding, is unique with that poem. Maybe there is a traceable similarity in terms of style and pattern, but the actual statement is unique in my understanding and my appreciation. And it has not been read, propagated, discussed enough, anywhere nearly enough. And it needs to be, not just in the communities that are addressed in the original Bangla language in which he wrote, but universally, internationally. I said, not these literally these words, but similar words I said when I first published, or I wrote the piece introducing Nazrul to English people in the English language kind of world, in the English Western world in the 70s. But that was not continued because the publication was in a magazine, I think, controlled by the British Communist Party. I didn't know that it was going to be published there, but it was published by somebody or with the help of somebody that requested me to write a piece about Nazrul, who I think had connections with the Communist Party. But I have been personally committed to publishing all the translations of Nazrul's main poetry that I call the rebel poetry, and I have done the translations. And where my work has gone, I shall discuss another time. Today, this is an introductory reference to Nazrul because yesterday, 29th of August, was the anniversary. He passed away on 29th of August in 1976 in Bangladesh. But in a publication called Dhaka Tribune, there is a completely wrong date that is given 26th of August as the date. But most of the reports are that he passed away on the 29th of August. Now, Nazrul and Sheikh Mujib and the doctor, the Professor Nurul Islam, who treated both of them, and the place where Nazrul passed away, these are exclusive. I'm revealing it exclusively, but not for the first time. I have said this before, but in this piece, I'm going to give some exact details. I was ill for 3 months, and those 3 months I spent at what is called the postgraduate hospital, PG hospital. And that is where, after myself, both the rebel poet and Sheikh Mujibur Rahman were treated by the same doctor. My doctor was Professor Nurul Islam. He wasn't a professor at the time, but he was a doctor. And both the rebel poet and the president of Bangladesh, who later became president of Bangladesh, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, were treated. So in a kind of time-lapsed way, we are kind of connected. Now, spiritually, I'm connected with Nazrul in any case, because when I first read his poetry, and I learned how to read and how to understand the concepts, I got very closely involved with what he was saying. Now, if there is a thing called influence from reading, then I think that can be quite clearly described as an influence. And post facto, Nurul Islam, the professor who treated both of them and me, that is connected in a historical way in terms of the philosophical and other observations which I shall be elaborating on in the course of the next editions, where I shall be continuing the discussion of Nazrul. Now, this is something that I have mentioned in an earlier edition about one of Nazrul's friends, personal friends, very close friends, Sufi Zulfikar Haider. As I said, I met Sufi Zulfikar Haider only one day, only for a few hours. And I met him while traveling to a place on the Buriganga River on a boat where we were trying to do some relief work because the flood had affected the country in 1970. And on the way back, not on the way there to the relief site, but on the way back, after I got off the boat and was walking back to a transport to go back to where I was living, I met this person, Sufi Zulfikar Haider. And he started telling me, while we were standing on the ground, he started telling me about himself and Nazrul Islam. And he said things I had not heard from anyone before, but I had suspected. And what he said was, most of the contemporaries, before Nazrul lost his health and the control of his brain faculties because he became unwell in his 40s. So Sufi Zulfikar Haider said that most of the contemporaries and people who were later, after Nazrul became ill, claiming to have known Nazrul and claiming to have supported him, were actually very jealous of him. And they were making up things and they were trying to kind of unsettle him and disturb him and discredit him and all the other things. So at that time, Zulfikar Haider hadn't written his book, which is, I hope, available. I had it, but I'll again discuss where that book has gone in a later discussion. So Zulfikar Haider, actually, when he wrote the book, I had already kind of lost contact with him. And after that particular meeting, only once meeting, I never had the time or the chance or the scope to make contact with him. Idea was to make contact with him and to get to hear first-hand accounts more and more, as much as he could tell me. But that never became possible. And I think that the nearest thing is to read his book and go through the actual events that he described. But essentially, Nazrul Islam was not supported by his contemporaries, who were more alarmed and unnerved by his absolute brilliance and his prolific capacity to write and his contributions and his involvement and his political stance and all that. So therefore, I think there was this theme running through all their reactions or responses to him. All there, by there, I mean the ones that Sufi Zulfikar Haider only briefly mentioned to me, not given me a whole list of names, but he gave me a sample of names, and that was 50 years ago. So I did not write, we were talking, so I didn't write anything, but I was absolutely fascinated by his conversation, and he is the only one that actually knew Nazrul that I met. And the other thing is that nobody had written about Nazrul in that way. People had expressed various reservations about the stylistic kind of approach or approaches that Nazrul followed, but nothing that Sufi Zulfikar Haider told me resembled anything like that. So I will be making up for it in terms of making up for the loss of connection with him or contact with him in later discussions. But that point that Sufi Zulfikar Haidar made about Qazi Nazrul Islam, the rebel poet, is linked to somebody who I think is now living in America or mostly lives in America. He is an academic and he has written a piece called, I think earlier this year, he has written a piece in English and he says that Nazrul is more than a rebel. And I shall discuss that in a minute, but I disagree with him because by rebel, he is misunderstanding. He is trying to promote the idea that rebel is a somewhat inadequate expression. And my understanding of rebel is a complete expression. The rebel is the whole work and the ideology and the commitment of Nazrul and the manifesto. It's the life profile of Nazrul. Everything, his lyrics and all the other works, his essays, his short stories, and his speeches, everything that Nazrul wrote and contributed are actually encapsulated and symbolized by the rebel tag, because that means that he is standing apart from the others who were not only not rebellious, but they were colluding and they were accepting all the injustice and all the wrongs and all the aesthetically ugly things that were going on. And the people who were, in Sufi Zulfikar Haidar's words to me, jealous of him, nasty, petty-minded, and most importantly, Sufi Zulfikar Haidar told me in that short conversation, absolutely ungrateful, because Nazrul was very generous. And he was helping, and he was completely, in many ways, the general outlook, not anything else, general outlook that I see from that description by Sufi Zulfikar Haidar. Obviously, it is impossible to recall the exact words. 50 years ago, it was a conversation, was that the allegations or the observation about some of the corrupt persons who claimed to be followers and supporters of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in the pre-Bangladesh years. Many people complained about them kind of exploiting Sheikh Mujib and his generosity. Now that is where Sheikh Mujib and Nazrul kind of resemble one another, in that the word was that any criticism of these supporters, Sheikh Mujib would ignore. He would not accept criticism of his followers by others. Now that is all I'm saying. I don't know the people and I didn't actually meet them. I didn't hear the conversation. That was the opinion given, third party people saying at the time that some of the problems politically created for Sheikh Mujib at the time were created by people who were exploiting his generosity, and he was not kind of reining them in. That was the general observation that I remember. And Sufi Zulfikar Haidar told me, that was after I heard those conversations about Sheikh Mujib, that Nazrul Islam helped a lot of people, contemporaries, because they flocked to him and they kind of surrounded him and they wanted to use his name and his what can be called fame, or his wide kind of profile, high profile that he had among certain people, because obviously I wasn't there and it was happening, about 100 years ago? 100 years ago or more than 100 years ago in Calcutta. when Sufi Zulfikar told me, it was 50 years ago. So even then, it is impossible to pinpoint the actual individuals and actual incidents. Sufi Zulfikar began to tell me about some incidents at that time, and the aim was on both our parts that we would meet soon for tea or coffee or something and have a longer discussion. But events moved very fast in 1970. That is when we were having the conversation. And we didn't get to meet and discuss and go through the various events that he was absolutely aware of, because he was talking about personal witnesses and personally witnessed events. Why this is important? Absolutely important. It's fundamentally important. Sheikh Mujib and Nazrul Islam was also very similar in that Sheikh Mujib brought him, Nazrul Islam, to Bangladesh in 1972, I think. Then he gave him a place, arranged for a decent housing in a location in Dhanmondi area in Dhaka. And unfortunately, the rebel poet passed away 4 years later. And at this stage, I'm still not sure about all the members of the rebel poet's family and his descendants, what happened and what they're doing. I'm not aware of any of them in terms of what they're doing and how many of them are alive or around. But this writer that I mentioned, who lives in, with an academic, who lives in part mainly in America and is from Bangladesh, he wrote a piece earlier this year, and he echoed what Sufi Zulfikar telling me. He echoed, not in words, not in an exact way, but what he is saying as an academic is, in my view, echoing what Sufi Zulfikar told me. He's saying that there is not enough studies of Nazrul Islam's work and life, and this academic is puzzled. He writes, he comes across as a, how shall I put it, careful academic. He's not a revolutionary, and he's not an original thinker. I think he's done his usual kind of degrees, and he has done a PhD, and he is now an expert on translating stuff. He has done a bit of translation from the Urdu poet Faiz Ahmad Faiz, who is not like Iqbal, but he is from the same kind of linguistic background. And Faiz Ahmad Faiz is probably, after Iqbal, the second most recognized poet if Pakistan is mentioned. And so in Pakistan, it's Faiz Ahmad Faiz after Iqbal, in my understanding. I may be wrong. Maybe some others have actually emerged since Faiz Ahmad Faiz made his contributions. But my understanding remains that Faiz Ahmad Faiz is still a very substantial influence in the literature, in the Urdu literature, but he may have composed other stuff. Now, this writer, the academic who lives in Michigan, has translated some of Faiz Ahmad Faiz's poetry. And I bet he has done quite a bit of Nazrul's poetry. So what he has said is that there is not enough reference to Nazrul, his work, in modern studies or studies of modern literature or modern poetry, wherever. Well, this is not surprising. And I take the point here to Subhash Bose. I mean, Subhash Bose who had the same cap or headgear as Nazrul, and I shall try and find the images to show exactly how similar their headgears were. He said, as I mentioned before in another edition, Subhash said that Nazrul was a lively person, a live person. Nazrul, in Bengali, he said, ekjon jento manush. Now, of course, there were millions of other people living and alive in jento. But for Subhash to describe Nazrul, not with any reference to his philosophy or anything, but as a jento manush, brings the narrative into what I call the opposite of janto, murda manush. What I call many people in the community walking, but they're dead. So I call in Siloti, I call them murda. Many of the local councillors in Tower Hamlets, many of the politicians in this country, in the House of Commons, everywhere, the ministers and whatever, most of them, based on their behavior, I call them murda. They're alive, they're breathing and everything, but they are not spiritually, mentally, morally, democratically, ethically alive and active. That is what Subhash Bose was meaning, that Nazrul was spiritually, ethically, morally, democratically, absolutely active and alive and kicking. Alive and kicking very much applies to Nazrul. He was intellectually able to kind of express himself for probably, say, 25 years. I have to check the number of years, but that is probably the most of the length of time that he was able to write and communicate and speak before he became unable to use his brains because of what is called, I'm not sure about the details of the actual diagnosis, but it is called Pick's disease. Apparently, he was diagnosed at a place in Austria, in Vienna, where they said he was suffering from Pick's disease. So whatever the actual name or the process of the illness was, Nazrul was, no way was he fully active intellectually for more than 30 years. Even if we accept that he began, even if we accept and assume that he began writing and speaking in those ways that are remembered by the world at the age of 10 or something. So 30 years. But in the 30 years, he contributed more than many other people in terms of just the quality or in terms of the volume. Other writers, thinkers, philosophers do over a longer period when they are active and not affected by what Nazrul was affected by. And regardless of the shortness or the brevity of his active years, the contributions he has left behind are in need of urgent, comprehensive, worldwide understanding, reading, distribution, and dissemination. So that was my purpose when I first spoke to somebody in this country in the 1970s, and I introduced Nazrul in a verbal kind of introduction. And it was followed by this person asking me or requesting me to write a piece, which I did. And I wrote a piece, not like sitting in a desk in a university kind of forum or place, but I was in the middle of fighting racist attackers that had invaded the space near our flat where I was staying at the time. In fact, I met this person in the course of a discussion that I had with them following the then latest racist attack. So it wasn't like I was on a kind of residential place, sitting there ideally on a veranda and writing at my leisure. I was doing what Nazrul wrote in many of his poems. It's an embattled position. And I think it is accurate and fair to say that I remain embattled against Newham Council, against Tower Hamlets Council, against most of the behavior of most of the UK government departments and even the United Nations because of its timidity. So my work is not done by sitting kind of leisurely at a place. It is done in between various bouts and engagements of real battles against injustice and against racism in this country, and a lot of misinformation and jealousy and spite and all the rest of it. Now, Nazrul wrote, the rebel poet wrote this one as well. This is absolutely the rebel poet. He's full of, this poem, I don't know how long he worked on it, but the imagery, the list of examples that he cites in it is indicative of quite deep understanding of Hindu traditions and the Hindu religion has got so many gods and goddesses and so many symbols. And he absolutely, completely applies all of them, or at least all the most relevant ones in his eyes. So the rebel poet is not written in the Bengali language or Bangla language that is part of the conversation. It is clearly written for people to spend time in understanding the words, the phrases, the imagery. So I've done this as a Siloti. I'm not a Bengali, so Bengali is not my mother tongue, as they say. But as I said before, I didn't need any dictionary or any consultant or anybody to understand some of the words that I never spoke or heard before and are not in the ordinary vocabulary in the even Bangladeshi language or East Pakistani language or Siloti language, most certainly. For example, the first stanza, Bolobir, Unnoto Momoshir, Shir Nehari Amari, Noto Shir Oi Shikor Himadrir. Nehari. Nehari is not a word that I know to be spoken in any part of Siloti language. Nehari, I never heard of it. And I never came across Nehari in my understanding or reading of the Bangla script or newspapers or whatever at the time. And I didn't want to look for a translation from somebody else or interpretation. I was struggling with myself to make sense of this. What does he mean? What could it mean? What could he mean in the context of his stanza? Shir Nehari Amari. Noto Shir Oi Shikor Himadrir. Now, what could he mean? And it came to me that the meaning of Nehari was in the following words. Noto Shir Oi Shikor Himadrir. So that means he was saying he was above. He was above the peak of the abode of ice. This is my translation. Abode of ice is Himalaya. That is Sanskrit based, and a lot of these Bangla words are actually Sanskrit words. So Notoshir, Oi Shikor Himadri. So that's how I understood Nehari. And to this day, nobody uses Nehari in the ordinary conversation. And for me, Nazrul's Bidruhi and other rebellious poets and poetry remain very much at the center of my engagement with Nazrul. Even if he wrote for 30 years or 25 years, what was he looking at? What was he looking at the time he was writing? What inspired him each time he wrote? And what was he saying? Because not only did he rebel against the British Empire and all its paraphernalia of imperialist denial and insult and outrage, which is why he was put in prison. This is comparatively easy. To rebel against an outside oppressor is absolutely comparatively easy. To rebel against the internal kind of complicated and complex darkness of submission, surrender, complicity, collusion, collaboration, and all the bad things that happen with occupation, that is what he was trying to address. Shikol pora chol re moder, shikol pora chol. This is it's a melodious expression of a most unacceptable state of being. He was saying that you have put us in shackles. He was saying to the British who had put him in prison, and he was writing literally about the shackles that had been put on his feet while he was in jail, in prison. And he was saying that by wearing these shackles, we shall free ourselves from your shackles. So it was absolutely brilliantly kind of neutralized. He neutralized the shackles and turned them into a melodious, almost glorious rendering or glorious kind of version of the experience. It could be performed given correct direction and organizing as a correct and absolutely appropriate counter to the rule Britannia rule. So he said, Shekol pora shekol toder korbore bikol. He said that we shall undo your shackles by wearing the shackles you have put us on our legs, on our body, and put us in. And then he has got, the rebel poet has got the poem called Onashon Bondi. I have translated that headline or that title as the Prisoners of Hunger. That is what Onashon is actually, fasting. But I have called it hunger for the impact it has. Because fasting is done in that context as a protest. But it is hunger. In protest, you go hungry. So that was the base which I used to translate Onashon Bondi, the prisoners of hunger. And I was also aware of the context that Nazrul was writing against, the background. So my translation is actually more than a translation in the literal sense. So my translation is wider and has been wider than Kabir Chaudhuri appears to understand. And it includes the context, the past, the future, and the present, and the engagement. So, and then he wrote about the international kind of anthem. And he wrote about Kandari Hushiyar, Durgam Giri, Kantar Moru, Dustor Parabar, Langite Have, Ratri Nishite, Jatri Rahushiyar. Now, all the recitations or abritti that I have been able to access from London, that have been available from Calcutta mainly, or some other parts, have been timid. These people are supposed to be reciting or reading the work, the poems of one of the most powerfully expressive writers. And they fall asleep or they send you to sleep. Most of them, and the singing, the actual kind of rendering to sing with the kind of orchestra and whatever behind, they all send you to sleep. Now, I don't know whether it is done on purpose, but the people who have been doing it for the last few decades are doing it wrong. They are un-Nazruling Nazrul on the actual effect of it. They're sending the most awake fighter and speaker to sleep in the way that they are reading. Somebody read in a school based performance, this rebel Bidruhi, and he's like he's a young boy, but he comes across as if he's doing a ritual. Bolobir. This is not how you should be reading Nazrul's Bidruhi. Bolobir Unnoto Bangashir. This is how he starts. Shir Nehari Amari. Noto Shir Oi Shikor Himadrir. As if you are standing not far from the Himalayas, the abode of ice, and declaring that you are higher than the height, the highest peak of the abode of ice, Himalayas. And this is the difference between, I think, my understanding of Nazrul and what is available everywhere as I have been able to access. I think there were some of the members of his family or some of his grandchildren or his son, one of his sons, was reading one of the poems. And I thought, now that is not how I would read Nazrul's poem, not that poem, not like that. So the reason is, why do they all read Nazrul as if it's not Nazrul, as if they are doing some kind of reading of some other dead poet, like, not poet that, or the poets whom Subhash Bose would call dead, as compared to his calling Nazrul Jento Manush. These are not Jento poets or writers. And I think that Nazrul needs to be made to sound as he would sound. I don't know whether there is any recording of him reading the main rebel poetry. But even if he read them, and read them like some of them are thinking he read them, my reading of Nazrul would be to read what I have just demonstrated. Bolobir Unnoto Mamashir. This is how it should be done. And if if I do a full version of the recitation and reading, I'll do the complete thing. Not in this edition, but I just wanted to refer to some of the things about Nazrul because this is the anniversary of his passing on the 29th of August, 1976 in Bangladesh. And I have included, of course, my own involvement or linear connection between him and the Dr. Professor Nurul Islam, who was the national professor, who I think has passed away, and Sheikh Mujib, who was also treated by Professor Nurul Islam. Both of them, Nazrul and Sheikh Mujib, were treated by the same person, same doctor, years after he had treated me. Now, I went back to the hospital after Bangladesh to look for him, but there was no staff or nobody there really that could tell me where he was or what had happened, because it was just immediately after the first week of January, I think I went there. And so therefore I never got to speak to Professor Nurul Islam. He was still not professor at the time, but he was an established member of the medical staff in the postgraduate hospital. Now, it is probably renamed now with an extended title, but that was what it was called. And I think that the connections are significant in my understanding of the world because I passed through various stages of various events. And the fact that there are these connections mean a lot of factual links to the narrative. So I have not lost the connections, and I have continued the connections, and I shall be continuing the connections, elaborate and extending those ones in an exclusive analysis and diagnosis of the roles played by these people who supported rebel poet in his time and the others who did the opposite. But nobody would remember them. Most of them would fade away, except one or two that have overexploited their connection with Nazrul and have become kind of quite personally beneficial rewards they have received, and based on their claim that they knew Nazrul. And Sufi Zulfikar Haidar's book and his work, I shall try to kind of explain it in my way in future editions, and probably I'll write a summarized kind of version of his book that has been published since my meeting, the one-off meeting with him. I had no idea who he was. He introduced himself to me. I can't remember how it happened, but we were leaving the boat after the trip we made to help some people with the relief work after the flood in Bangladesh in the river Buriganga. And he was dressed in a modest way as a Sufi, as a thoughtful person, and he spoke with dedication and concern, and he was extremely devoted to the cause of Nazrul Islam's legacy and his contribution and his experience and humanity and his compassion and his generosity as a person. And he clearly very much missed his days with Nazrul Islam because of the illness of the poet. And the other things happened in the subcontinent. The countries became involved in all kinds of hostilities. So therefore, that is the reason why he couldn't maintain the connections. But he was absolutely frank with me, and I am able to remember all these years later, 50 years later, that conversation with him. And I have been able to do that also because of the evidence I have found elsewhere, that what he was saying was absolutely true and resonated with the evidence that others have provided. And observations made by this person who lives in Michigan in the USA, but he's a Bangladeshi and is an academic. And I think his name is Afruz Hussein or Afruz Ahmad. I shall check that and I shall come back with the correct name. And Afruz Ahmad is, he's got a kind of academic career as an academic, and he has traveled to Cuba and Kenya, and he recalls some of the conversations that he had with people in Cuba and in Kenya about Nazrul Islam. Because he says that in Cuba, when he read some of the Nazrul poems or translations, the Cubans, he was talking to say that, well, Nazrul is a Cuban poet. And the same or similar reaction he came across when he did the same in Kenya. The Kenyan people he was speaking to said that Nazrul is a Kenyan poet. So what he was meaning is that there was this universal lines that Nazrul's poems contained that were also contained in the Cuban and the Kenyan poets or poetry. Now that justifies my assertion right from the beginning that Nazrul is a world poet in that sense that he applies world values and world messages, even when, as this writer says, he didn't know Cuba or Kenya. Of course he didn't, because these were not free or available at the time that Nazrul was writing. But the universality of his message applies to Cuba, Kenya, and elsewhere. So this is the one day late kind of anniversary of Nazrul's passing, which is 30th of August to the 2020. And he passed away on the 29th of August, 1976. And as I said, there is a lot of work that should have been done on Nazrul's work, but hasn't been done. This is astounding, especially when he was given the kind of honor of being the national poet of Bangladesh, although it was not, I don't think, with his knowledge, because he was not able to comprehend things, or he could not express his response to people speaking to him for so long before he passed away. But whatever his ability and disabilities, the fact that he was given this position and he still is known as the national poet of Bangladesh warrants a national or nationwide kind of effort to bring his work to the nation in a way that helps people understand life, society, and also the enlightening melodies that he wrote. They are there. Firuza Begum is clearly somebody that has helped put on the record so much of his melodies. But there are things that need to be done still, a lot, with thousands of his lyrics and thousands of other pieces of his writing and thousands of his other words and his engagements. And the most important thing in the context of talking about Nazrul in Britain, from Britain, is this: why did they put him in jail? Why did they imprison him? I mean, Nazrul was a Sufi. In my understanding of him, he was not a thief. So why did they put him in jail? And that has to be explored and understood why. I mean, was he put in jail because he effectively defied Thomas Babington Macaulay, who said that English would be the language of the Indians, that is, the Indians under the British Empire, and they would look Indian, brown, whatever, but internally they would think English as English persons. And there was Nazrul, totally defying all of that and writing in the Bangla language some of the most original and powerful works that put Thomas Babington Macaulay and Clive and all the others in the correct position in the whole of darkness and denial. So we shall be talking about Nazrul more, and I shall be reading more of his Bidruhi rebel poetry, and I shall be doing that after going through some of the rest of the papers today, which is Sunday, the 30th of August 2020. Now, in the Observer, the new review, the main piece is how the vaccine race got dirty. So their illustration of that article is with this needle, this one. So what are they saying? They're saying the scientists worldwide are working to find a viable coronavirus vaccine. But are corners being cut for politics and profit? That is a piece by Laura Spinney. Well, that summary, of course, gives the game, well, the contents away, actually. It doesn't need and this competition for a speedy, fast vaccine is, of course, linked with the campaign against vaccine and the various other things that have been going on, including the many conspiracy theories that link Microsoft's Bill Gates to a plot going back decades to invent a vaccine to destroy most of humanity and to murder people by vaccine. Now, this is the scary kind of image that the pro-vaxxers, so supporters of the vaccine, have been peddling in the mainstream media, saying that anyone who says that vaccines are part of a conspiracy to murder people are conspiracy theories. But it seems that the mainstream media, of which the Observer is a part, are admitting, and that admission is in that piece, that there are various questions among the non-conspiracy theorists, the straightforward, if you like, supporters of the vaccine, because of the things that are going on, that it has become a most profitable kind of business. And I think that it will be worth trillions, not billions. By the time they get this fixed and get the majority of the hundreds of millions of people kind of subjected to the vaccine, it will be worth much more than all the combined known wealth of Bezos and Gates himself and Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and all the other people, because this is affecting the health and safety and the lives of millions, hundreds of millions of people worldwide. So this is something that will continue to dominate the discussion. Now, earlier I said about the poll that the Observer is reporting on, that the Labour Party is getting a poll boost. But even without reading the full copy, line by line, I can say quite safely that this is absolutely artificial. This is artificial because the number of MPs that are there in the Conservative Party, as fronted by Boris Johnson, 80 MPs, even if 10 of them refuse to vote for any motion, that would make a significant difference or defining difference to the state of government as run by one party or the other and the election and so forth. It is unforeseeable at this stage, I cannot foresee it, that the Tories will lose a vote in the House of Commons, because the majority is so many MPs, like 80. And the other artificiality in the Observer piece is that it doesn't discuss or examine or diagnose. It cannot diagnose. It is not meant for diagnosis. It is meant for propaganda and concealment. It doesn't diagnose or examine or tell the truth about Keir Starmer and what would happen in a scenario where Keir Starmer replaces a Johnson-fronted kind of regime with a Keir Starmer-fronted regime, whatever number of years later. There is no evidence that Keir Starmer would perform any better for the poor people, the low-income people, people in dire need of protection under human rights law and all the other issues that the Tories are actually betraying the society on and are capitalizing on in order to keep the brainwashed people, the gullible people, hooked on the hatred idea, on the line of hatred. So that needs to be provided for by anyone who thinks that Johnson is losing the grip and he needs to kind of stop the Labour Party gaining ground. As I have said, Keir Starmer has completely messed up the Labour Party, and there is no alternative image, the alternative provision there. There is no alternative manifesto associated with Keir Starmer in power as the Prime Minister. And the Sunday Times, which is obviously owned by Murdoch and is supporter of the Conservatives and supporter of Boris Johnson, is saying that the current finance minister, Rishi Sunak, is planning taxes on what he's saying is the mainly wealthy Tory supporters. And the other piece they're running on the front page is, of course, another plug for Donald Trump and a warning against Biden. Then they're saying it's a piece by Josh Glancy. They're saying that Black Lives Matter riots have damaged Joe Biden. And they're saying that Democrats fear voters will be driven into the arms of Trump, especially after these Kenosha riots. Now, that is a line that is expected and predicted from the Sunday Times, which is in effect summarizing what Fox News is doing every single hour. And they're all talking about back to school and all the rest of it. What I have said before is that there is nothing about the society, about the housing, about the poverty, and about, of course, the migrants. Nothing in the Sunday Times. It's all typical, trendy, and right-wing, soft pedal journalism. The Sunday Times is the soft pedal one, and the Sun on Sunday is the hardcore right-wing version of the Murdoch operations in Britain. And Murdoch is gearing up for further assaults. Once he has launched the Times Radio against the BBC, and he's now going to launch something that will replace the original idea that this Sky News had, and he's going to establish a television news organization that will be very much like the Fox News in here. I am predicting. They have not said it, but that is what I think he's plotting. And again, Keir Starmer is dead. I mean, in political terms, to use the language of Subhash Bose, he's there, but he's hardly moving. And the fact that the polls show that Boris Johnson is losing the support, or the Observer, or whoever are celebrating the loss by Boris Johnson of the popular opinion, it doesn't amount to Keir Starmer getting in and delivering, to quote John McDonnell last week, socialist manifesto. Socialist meaning all the socially desirable measures. And here I have got a Sunday Post. It's not an English paper. It's written in English, but it's not an English political paper. It's from somewhere else. It's either Ireland or it's Scotland. It's not definitely not an English paper. And we shall be coming to that. It's a Scottish one. It's based in Glasgow. Sunday Post is saying that care homes, we had 846 staff tested, 6 results. As the care home kind of scandal, but we shall leave that on its own without going into the details because it's not revealing anything new. What it is containing and what the London papers are not is a follow-up on this death of the young mother in her 30s, death by hunger, starvation in Glasgow. So Marcy Beguma, the Ugandan woman whose father, Abdul Balingira Nakindu, a former Ugandan MP, said 34-year-old Marcy Beguma came to the UK as a student in 2006. And he is appealing for the people of Glasgow to provide whatever information they have about her dying. So he spoke to the Sunday Post in Glasgow and he said, I want to know what killed my daughter. I'm wondering what happened. I'm really surprised. My daughter was healthy, so how did she die? I hear she was found there alone in the house. The dead body was found alone in the house when the child is crying, almost dying. So I want to find out what's going on. He added, our religion dictates that we hold a prayer after 4 days for a woman, but this incident was abrupt and terrible because my daughter was very far, many miles away from me. So there is no recognition by the papers in Fleet Street about the death of this person, asylum seeker, Marcy Beguma in Glasgow. And as I said, the Fleet Street papers and British papers everywhere are now suddenly reporting the death of a black film star actor almost in a similar way with the prominence they give to white persons who die, actors and whatever like that. And it's the Black Panther actor that they are treating with this rare kind of recognition. But the Sunday Mirror is back to the mode of being a tabloid containing idiocy for the brainwashed or brainwashable people. There is no theme. There is no theme against poverty. There is no theme about public health safety. There is no theme about really examining the evidence of the behavior that is destroying society. And there is most certainly nothing about the racist attacks on the asylum seekers. And no mention of this woman who died in Glasgow. I'm looking for it. But they've got 2 pages on the actor, the film actor who acted in the Black Panther film. But they've got Banksy, the mysterious artist, in the news. Now he knows how to exploit any news situation. He's like the Bob Geldof in a different kind of stylistic kind of way. He appears whenever there is news, you think. So he apparently paid money for the hiring of a boat and rescue of the migrants. And it says that his boat was stranded and the migrant died. And a second migrant was found dead on the on the ship. essentially, if Banksy has to make the news about migrants, then what's the point of having an opposition? Because the opposition is not opposing. The opposition is not opposing the complete betrayal of the country by the Tories. And that is what amounts to the opposition being politically dead. So it's not just the termless councillors and new councillors who are politically in a state of being dead like Murda. It's the UK central political opposition fronted by Keir Starmer. And the newspapers are completely dead as well. Because no evidence in the papers, Sunday papers, that there is an opposition. And what is even worse, there is no indication that the opposition should be alive and kicking in the face of so many things going wrong for society. And the Sunday Express, of course, is a part of the anti-Scots political arm of the propaganda that Boris Johnson benefits from. And they are having a go at the SNP, accusing the SNP of betraying the children, throwing the children under the bus. And there is nothing about the death of the asylum seeker, Marcy Beguma in Glasgow. Instead, they have got a piece against the Scots. And there is nothing about housing, nothing about the eviction, and nothing about the spread of the virus that is continuing. And nothing at all about what Labour Party makes of any of it. Nothing. So the Sunday papers on Sunday the 30th of August 2020 are empty of substance and stuffed with fake news and fake propaganda for the Tories. And they've got the typical, the Daily Star on Sunday has got the typical pornographic stuff in there that shows that there is no pandemic crisis anymore, and there is no problem in this country politically caused by Boris Johnson fronted regime. And lots of stuff about film and soap actors and actresses, and the return of Dennis Houghton, who used to be a breakfast television kind of presenter, an over-promoted presenter. And there is, of course, a positive obit on the Black Panther actor who died at age 43. And the Sun on Sunday is stuffed full of sub-pornographic garbage on the front page. And there is nothing in the paper about the death of the woman, refugee, asylum seeker in Glasgow, death of starvation. And they are in fact running asylum price list, which is the lawyers' legal aid charges for migrant cases. So they're running a piece about lawyers charging too much in cases where asylum seekers need their help. Now, this reminds of what I say about the lawyers. These lawyers are not lawyers. I am a lawyer, but I am not a licensed law trader. I'm a genuine lawyer and a legal scholar, and I have been for a very long time. But I don't exploit a license in order to fleece the victims of injustice and wrongdoing. I do it for free, and I do it without any fees. That is this item about an Indian origin woman called Uma Devi Rajasundram. Her name suggests that she is from South India or Tamil Nadu or thereabouts. And it's saying that a law firm is accused of shamelessly touting a price list to help migrants stay in the UK. Officials blasted activist lawyers for listing charges that will cost taxpayers thousands in legal aid. London firm Milestone Solicitors asked for £1,500 for deportation cases, £2,000 for appeals, asylum appeals, and £2,500 for final appeals. Boss Uma Devi Rajasundram, 52, boasts about successful cases on their Facebook page. And to counter that boastful solicitor, Uma Devi Rajasundram, they have got Tory MP Peter Bone. Now, this man makes no bone of anything. I mean, he is completely available for any kind of rent a quote, and he is rented here. And he's saying that some of these solicitor firms' actions are despicable, which is predictable, but he's a right-winger Brexiteer and a racist. And he is not alone. Most of the Conservative MPs have been in that form, although Bone has been more kind of available on platforms than many of the others. But as I said about Kenneth Clark earlier, no, there is no such thing as a moderate Tory. All Tories are followers of the same ideology of robbing the society, destroying the planet, and depriving the people of their rights and making them and keeping them in poverty and hunger, in low income and no income. And they don't recognize society. Now, here is the former Australian Prime Minister, the racist Tony Abbott. The racist Tony Abbott I'm calling because he is now being given a spot on the Australian Murdoch-owned scum on page 10. He's saying that Commonwealth nations vital for UK trade. He's reviving the British Empire. They left the European Union saying that they will get back control, and they said that the world would be open to business with Britain. There is a problem because the reason why the empire collapsed economically was because the economic case was not sustainable. Simple. And for them to say that the empire is going to be revived suggests only one thing, that they are about to confect a number of lying kind of plugs to lure the brainwashed parts of the empire, ex-empire, back to dealing with Britain as if Britain had something to offer. And that is the problem, because Economically, Britain doesn't have anything to offer in comparison with other trading partners. And when Britain will be competing with a bloc like the remaining EU, which is not going to disintegrate contrary to the expectations of the likes of Johnson and others, the British trading success will depend on the terms of the trade. Number one. Number two, the needs for British goods and services by those trading countries. That is not obvious. And this woman, who is the product of a porn billionaire, Karen Brady, and is in the House of Peers, placed there by a racist, David Cameron, has got a space as a column in the Murdoch paper. And she signs the collection of tosh and rubbish that are written for her. And she's a racist who aids and abets the racist Alan Sugar on The Apprentice. So the Fleet Street Sunday is not a place for newspapers. It's a den of corruption, racism, lying, and denial. And the Sunday Sun is as reliable as evidence as is the sun on the weekdays, as being representative of denial, racism, corruption, and lying. And they don't want the society to be made any liberal, tolerant, fair, or equitable. And this is the look, very brief look at the papers available from Fleet Street today, Sunday, the 30th of August, 2020. And I hope that the greater part of this edition, which I have given to a discussion of the rebel poet Qazi Nazrul Islam in the context, will be helpful. And all of it, what I've said, is covered by the laws that are running in the bottom line of the ticker line. And anyone who needs to refer to this or any of the editions can read the line and look up the various terms, authoring rights, copyrights, but they're welcome to refer to this. As long as they refer to this expressly and clearly, then they're welcome to do it, and that is the purpose. So until the next edition, this is 5 minutes to 1 GMT, that is, this is 12:55 GMT on Sunday, the 30th of August, 2020.